Foxhole's world is a war-torn land with two main factions, the Colonials and the Wardens, fighting for dominance. I get asked the question, which faction should I join by new players a lot, so today I'm going to talk about each faction and give you information that will help you make the decision easier. I will be talking about the aesthetics of each faction, their equipment, the balance of that equipment, the culture, faction loyalism, and finally the lore. One important thing to note that as a new player, you won't experience a ton of differences between the factions right away as you are learning the game. However, the factions do absolutely have advantages and disadvantages that become more apparent the longer you play and the more serious you get about the game. I should also note that I tend to switch between factions every 2 to 3 wars. I will try my best during this video to remain as neutral as possible. I know that some of you will hear what I say and think that I may still have a bias towards one faction. Feel free to call me out on it and correct me. With that, let's get started with how each faction looks, or as the youth like to say, their drip. I would say that one of the main reasons a new player picks a faction is based on how they look. The Warden uniforms have a World War I French feel to them, whereas the Colonials have more of an American military look. I've talked to plenty of players that picked their faction based on these facts alone. 3 years ago, when I was deciding what faction I wanted to play, I decided on the Wardens because I liked the blue uniforms and the snowy environment. I still say today that I prefer how the Warden vehicles look over the Colonial vehicles when it comes to things like Logi trucks and tanks. That brings us to our next difference between the factions: equipment. Long ago, when Foxhole first came out about 6 years ago, both sides actually had the same equipment. Eventually, the devs had decided they wanted to move away from the symmetrical gameplay and move more towards an asymmetrical gameplay. This simply means that both factions have their own equipment that is different from one another. Different rifles, different grenades, different vehicles, and so on. If you want to get an idea for what these differences are before picking a faction, you can simply open up the Foxhole wiki and look at the different factions' equipment, and then you can choose the one that you think looks like the style you would enjoy the most. There are still a few players out there that miss the days when each faction had the same equipment. I, for one, am glad that the devs went the asymmetrical route. This basically doubles the stuff players can play with by simply switching to a new faction each war. It helps make each faction more unique and I think more enjoyable. Infantry weapons are generally similar with slight advantages for either side. Some of these weapons are better in certain situations, but it doesn't radically alter your gameplay. The same applies to vehicles. Both factions have certain qualities to their vehicles that suit just slightly different playstyles. If you like the other faction's rifle or tank, you can simply still capture the enemy's equipment and use it. Some people will hate me for this, but I unironically think the asymmetrical style is a good vision that the devs have for the game. Though I never got to play wars when they had the same equipment myself, it sounds like it would get pretty boring after a while. But going the asymmetrical route was not an overall positive outcome for the game and the players. Having this system in the game means it's a balancing nightmare. I'm not going to get into the balance for each gun or vehicle in the game. Players could write 60-page doctoral dissertations on game balance in Foxhole, and as a new player, I would not recommend concerning yourself with game balance when choosing a faction for the first time. You are unlikely to be able to tell the difference. At the time of this video, the current war is 115. The Wardens have won 59 wars and the Colonials have won 55 wars. Vet players can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've ever seen a faction have 10+ war lead on the other faction. There is rarely an underdog faction, and if that faction is the underdog, normally the devs just buff them until they start winning again. At least that's what I've seen in the 3 years I've been playing. I'm going to give you my current balance perspective at this time during War 115. If you were watching this at a later date, then things may have changed. During the early war, infantry equipment decides who is going to win each battle. This is because higher tier vehicles and artillery have not been researched yet. Colonials at this time, in my opinion, have the better infantry early war equipment. The Wardens are normally having to build more defensively to keep the Colonial onslaught back. When we get to the mid-game or mid-war, which is normally around 5 to 10 days into the war, early light tanks and artillery start to come onto the battlefield. The Wardens start to receive a few power spikes with the equipment to balance out against the early advantages the Colonials had. Then we get to the late game, which I believe starts almost any time past day 15 of a war. Both factions start to unlock their mainline tanks and high artillery options like the 150mm. The idea, though it may not currently be the case, is that both sides are supposed to be balanced at this time. I'm quite sure there will be essays in the comments about how I am wrong and where one faction is severely at a disadvantage right now. Again, after playing the game for over 3 years, both sides always have something to say about why their faction is the weaker faction and why the other is stronger. But at a very simple level, I will say that the Colonials currently have a better infantry kit and the Wardens have better tank options. Again, I will not get into any specific details of production, health, or damage of any of this equipment. I will just leave my statement as is and welcome any constructive criticism as it comes. Because the game is asymmetrical, both sides will complain about one another's equipment, but as a new player, this is nothing you should concern yourself about. Your main goal should be having fun. Both sides have their advantages and disadvantages, but it's up to each faction on how they utilize their tools. Because Foxhole is so massive and wars last so long, sometimes longer than a month, I don't think the balance in the game is currently what prevents either side from winning. What I do think plays an important role is the culture of each faction. Culture is another element that is different from faction to faction. These thoughts on culture from each faction are my personal thoughts and again may differ from what other Foxhole players think. And these cultural differences may change over time and might be different if you are watching this video at a later date. I believe the Wardens to be more competitive and more organized than the Colonials. There's more of a focus on clans and less focus on random players on the battlefield. Colonials, from my perspective, can be quite the opposite. Colonials seem to be more focused on organized chaos and are possibly the more laid back of the two factions. I often see more random players pushing on the front in an organized fashion and more operations done by random players on the Colonial side than I do the Warden side. This does not mean that it doesn't happen on the Warden side, I just see it more frequently on the Colonial side. You may see both sides claim to be the more noob-friendly side, but I honestly think that both sides help new players in a very positive way. Both sides have their toxic players as well, and I wouldn't say one side is more toxic than the other. As we've seen from recent events, both sides have their own civil wars where players don't agree and will sometimes fight over resource fields. I think any player claiming that their side is more friendly to new players or has less toxic players is doing a disservice to the other faction and is wrong. Some players do this because they have what we call faction loyalism. Tribalism is an actual thing that happens not only in the real world but also in Foxhole. I think that tribalism or faction loyalists, as we like to call them in Foxhole, are actually a good thing for the game within reason. I mentioned that I switch factions every 2 to 3 wars. That's only because I'm a content creator for Foxhole and I want my content to remain as neutral as possible and I want to highlight both sides of the community. But before I was a content creator for Foxhole, I had about 500 hours in the game where I played mainly for the Warden faction. I probably had 30 plus wars under my belt before I switched over to the Colonial side. And after a new player tries both factions out, I normally recommend that a player stick to one faction at least 90% of the time. I think dedicating yourself to that faction can make the game more enjoyable and make the battles and wars feel more impactful if you tie some emotion to it. I think faction loyalists should switch to the other faction every now and then so that they won't become jaded on game balance. Switching factions every now and then can be enlightening for some players and make you objectively better at the game knowing how each side's equipment and vehicles operate. I think it helps players have the balanced discussion in good faith if they've played both sides. As we discussed, the balance of Foxhole has had its fair share of imbalanced updates for as long as I've been playing, and the pendulum has swung in both directions many times. We should be encouraging the devs to make balance changes for the better health of the game instead of celebrating when our faction seems to be on top because of these balance changes. There's a side to faction loyalism that is bad for the game, and what I think can cause some brain rot with some players. If you get in too deep with a faction, it can cause players to be extremely biased towards things like balance. It can also cause players to be nasty or toxic towards the other faction's players or culture and spread propaganda that I feel crosses the line. An example of this would be a faction loyalist telling new players that the other faction has an awful attitude towards new players, which again, as I mentioned before, this is not true. Now, I don't think trash talking the other faction is inherently wrong. I think there's a proper way to do it where you can spread your faction's propaganda without crossing a line. And unfortunately, there are some players out there that love to cross that line. Tribalism at the end of the day is a social trait that is hardwired into all humans. If you want to be a faction loyalist, find a way to do it in a healthy manner. I will note that the subreddit for Foxhole probably has some of the worst faction loyalism you will ever see. It's much worse there than it is in game. If you are shouting at the enemy faction, it should have some level of humor and respect to it. Faction rivalry at the end of the day should just be healthy banter towards one another. On that note, the last faction difference comes with the story of Foxhole, the lore. This will not be a deep dive into the lore. I've actually had quite a few people ask me to make a video about the lore of Foxhole, but I don't think I have the creative style to do it justice. I would really like to see someone like Freerick or I Saw a Bear do a deep dive video on Foxhole lore. I feel like they would do a much better job than I would. It should be noted for new players as well that lore really never shows up in the day-to-day gameplay. The Colonials are descendants of an ancient empire that once ruled much of the known world. They pride themselves on their rich history and traditions. They seek to reclaim their former glory and believe that their way of life is superior. They have a strong military heritage. The Wardens emerged from a coalition of smaller nations and states that banded together to resist the expansion of the colonial empire. They fight to maintain their sovereignty and independence. They view themselves as the defenders against the colonial imperialists. From what I've read, the Wardens used to control all of the Foxhole map that we see today. But apparently the Colonials sparked a widespread rebellion which ended up destroying the former capital of the Wardens, which was now known as Abandoned Ward. The Colonials eventually rose to power with other individual cities and states, and the Wardens were forced to retreat past the Bulwark Wall. This is where we start the present-day wars. The lore is highly debated on who is right and who is wrong for each faction. If there are two things that Foxhole players will fight over till the end of time, it's balance and the lore of Foxhole. Yes, the Colonials are marching into the Warden territory, but it's not clear who fired the first shot. I'm sure even with what I'm saying in this video will be highly debated in the comments. As I stated, I won't go into any more detail about the lore because some players can get pretty heated about what is accurate lore and what is misinformation. I believe the devs with the lore have tried to paint a picture that there really is no good or bad guys, and I think this was very intentional. If the devs were to make one side the bad guys in the game, game that is loosely based on World War I and II, you might invite some nasty groups to join one faction over the other. If you want more information about the lore, I recommend you do your own research and come to your own conclusions about who you think is right or wrong in this conflict. Again, the lore does not play a huge role in Foxhole overall. It's more of just something fun on the side. Now, some other smaller, lighthearted details about the faction differences are that Wardens are called blueberries and the Colonials are called goblins. Wardens are femboys and Colonials are furries. Wardens have faith in Callahan and the Colonials worship Theomero's feet. Green man good, blue man bad, or vice versa. Do you like snowy mountains or grassy plains? These are just some of the fun things to think about when picking a faction. From my experience, it seems like a lot of new players always want to join the side that is losing. The devs will sometimes show you this screen when picking a faction where one faction is in the red. This is just a recommendation based on queue times. As a new player, you should probably pick the faction that is not red because you will spend less time in a queue. But it should also be noted that this is just a recommendation, that you can still pick the other faction. I've seen a lot of new players confused by this and thought they could only pick one faction. Once you pick a faction though, you have about 5 minutes to decide if you want to switch to the other faction before you are locked in for the war. After that, you will have to wait till the current war is over to be able to pick the other faction. This is normally not a big deal for new players unless you're trying to play with friends. I will say if you have friends that are already playing, joining their faction can help you have a better experience. Overall, by all accounts, neither side is nicer and both have their share of toxic players. As I said before, try out both factions for a few wars before becoming a faction loyalist. Or if you want, you can remain more of a neutral party and continue to switch factions every so often like I do. Each faction has their ups and downs, and sometimes it's not even the community's fault entirely. Sometimes the game can be pretty imbalanced for a long period of time, but the devs are doing their best to test things out and make it as balanced as possible. When you first start playing Foxhole, it really isn't very important which faction you pick as long as you are having fun. I know a lot of players that think winning the war is the only way to have fun, but I personally have had more fun on the losing side. Both factions are very welcoming and willing to teach new players how to play the game. If you still really don't know which faction to pick after this, flip a coin. Some people overthink which side they should be on. You can be on whichever faction you want and swap anytime you want with no pressure. Each side has its toxic clans, its casual clans, its sweaty tryhards, and its chill players. There's a group for everyone on either side. The only real difference is the equipment. Both factions have dedicated and passionate communities as well. You just need to explore which community you feel more connected to and which one resonates more with your playstyle. I hope this video has helped you learn more about each faction in Foxhole. For my vet players, which faction did you pick for your first war and why? What factions are you in now and why should someone join your faction? Let me know in the comments. I didn't touch on this in the video, but do you think one faction has a better terrain advantage over the other? Let me know your thoughts on this. Thank you all so much for watching and for your support. Make sure to subscribe for more Foxhole content. I'll see you all out on the battlefield. Cheers.